Good day to everyone. This is the last part of our report for job order costing, which is answering the assigned problems to our group. The first assigned problem to us is PR2-2A. The tasks given for this problem is to do entries and schedules for unfinished jobs and completed jobs. So first problem is Tidy Industries Incorporated. So before we go through the problem, first we have to know what is required of the problem so we can actually be guided on how to answer this particular problem. So the first requirement would be to journalize the entries to record the summarized operations, post appropriate entries to T accounts for work in process and finished goods, using the identifying letters as transaction codes, insert memo account balances as of the end of the month. Number 3, prepare a schedule of unfinished jobs to support the balance in the work in process account. Prepare a schedule of completed jobs on hand to support the balance in the finished goods account. So with this, let's start with the requirement number 1, which is journalizing the entries as they happen. Tidy Industries Incorporated uses a job order cost system. The following data summarize the operations related to production for January 2016, the first month of operations. So the first transaction is materials purchased on account for $29,800. So the journal entry for that is this one. Since you have purchased materials, so debit materials for $29,800 and accounts payable since the materials were purchased in account for $29,800. For the next transaction, we have materials requisition and factory labor used. So this actually pertains to production already. With that, our entry for this is this one. We have entries for work in process, factory overhead, and materials and wages payable. So to know the specifics of the calculation, let's see our supporting computations. So as indicated above, our materials should total 27,010. So this should be our credit to our materials, which is correct. And then for our wages payable, which pertains to the total labor used, it should be 27,950, which is all of these labor costs. If you want to actually know the particulars of the formula, you can actually click on the cell, and then you'll see which specifics are these ones. So what were added were all of the materials pertaining to January. Okay. Same with our labor. This one. Okay. Now for our total amount to be debited to our work in process pertaining to materials and labor, we should only total those materials and labor used by specific jobs. So for this matter, the total is 49,780 as shown here. And for our factory overhead, those should only pertain to the materials and labor used for general factory purposes, which is 5,180. So if you want to verify whether your journal entry is correct or not, then you have to check whether both the debit and the credits are equal. So for that matter, we can check by using this one. And then, so as you can see, both the debit and the credit are equal. So next, let's go to our third transaction. So it's here. The third one is factory overhead costs incurred on account for $5,500. The entry for such is this one. Now, we have to remember that actual factory overhead costs incurred are debited to factory overhead, while for the factory overhead applied, it would pertain to a debit to work in process and a credit to factory overhead. So with that in mind, so the incurred factory overhead of 5,500 should be debited to factory overhead 5,500, and since it was indicated that those costs were incurred on account, so we credit accounts payable for the same amount. For our first transaction, we have depreciation of machinery and equipment, 1980. So with this, the entry for such would be, again, since it was in the actual factory overhead costs incurred, so debit to factory overhead 180, and then credit to accumulated depreciation factory 1980. For our fifth transaction, it's the factory overhead rate is $54 per machine hour. Machine hours used are as follows. So for this one, this is what I mentioned a while ago for factory overhead applied, which should be debited to work in process inventory and credited to factory overhead. For this, we can just simply multiply the total number of machine hours used, which is 228, and then multiply it by our rate per hour, which should give us a total of 12,312. But if you want a more detailed calculation, we can see it through here. So our factory overhead applied per job should be this one, totaling to $12,312. With that, let's go to our sixth transaction. So our sixth transaction is the completion of jobs 301, 302, 303, and 305. For that matter, we can calculate the amounts that should be debited to finished goods and credit to work in process through this entry. And the supporting calculation for this is this one. So as mentioned a while ago, the jobs finished were jobs 301, 302, 303, and 305. For the material, labor, and factory applied costs for these jobs, we can check it through the tables above. So for the materials and labor, the data is here. And for our factory overhead applied, the data is here. So with that in mind, for example, for 301, materials is 2960, which is found here. And then for our labor, 2775, which is found here. And our factory overhead applied, which is found here. So for a total of 7,085. So do the same for 302, 303, and 305. You'll get a total finished good costs of 34,804 as shown in this entry. For our last transaction, jobs 301, 302, and 303 were sold. So for this, the entry would be, there should actually be two entries for this, since for job order cost systems, the inventory system used by companies is perpetual, meaning as soon as you record your sale, you should also record the related cost of goods sold for such items. So with that, for our total sales, since this were just billed, so no payment were received, we have to account for it as accounts receivable. And sales totaling 34,450. Related cost of goods sold for the sold items, we simply have to add the costs of jobs 301, 302, and 303. The calculations for such is found here. Actually, the data from this table is just derived from this table. The table for the calculations of the finished goods. So since we sold 301, 302, and 303, we simply have to use the data for these items, which would give us a total of 22,294 for our costs of goods sold. So requirement number 1 is done. For our requirement number 2, we were told to post the appropriate entries to the accounts for work in process and finished goods. So for this, your clue actually is just simply to look at these journal entries and look for entries to work in process and finished goods and post them to their T accounts. The T account should look like this. So it's called a T account because it looks like a T. On the left side, we have the debit, and the right side, we have our credit. So let's go back to our entries. For entry A, there's no entry for work in process. For entry B, we have a debit of 49,780. So we post that to the debit side of our work in process. Letter B, 49,780, a debit. And then for the next one, letter C, we don't have any entry for in process along with transaction D. For transaction E, we have a debit of 12,312,000 pertaining to our factory overhead applied. So we post it to the debit side of our work in process, 12,312, as you can see here. And then for transaction F, this pertains to the completed jobs. So credit to work in process amounting to 34,804. So we post that to our T account for work in process. We have 34,804 credit. Now let's see if we have some more items. For transaction G, no more entries to our work in process. So with that, we simply add our debits and our credit. So for our ending balance, we simply subtract the the credit from the debit side, and then so 62,092 less 34,804, that gives us an ending balance of 27,288. Now, in determining on which side the ending balance should rest, it depends on which side is greater. For this, in this case, the debit is greater than the credit, thus the ending balance should be on our debit side, which amounts to 27,288. For our finished goods, transactions A, B, C, D, and E, there's no entries to the finished goods. So transaction F, we have a debit of 34,804, which can be seen here. And for transaction G2, a credit of 22,294. So since there are no other entries, we simply deduct the two amounts, and that gives us the ending balance of a debit, which is 12,510. Now, in our requirement number 3, we are tasked, and 3 and 4, we are tasked to prepare a schedule for unfinished jobs, which is our work in process, and completed jobs on hand, which is our ending finished goods account. So it could be corroborated. So with that, let's see our calculations here. So as you can see here, for our unfinished jobs, if you can remember, only jobs 301, 302, 303, and 305 were finished, which means that jobs 304 and 306 are unfinished. So we simply have to import their information on materials, labor, and factory overhead, which can be seen in this table and in this table. So this should give us a total of unfinished goods amounting to 27,288, which is equal to our ending work in process inventory as shown in our T account. For our finished goods on hand, now since we have finished jobs 301, 302, 303, and 305, but sold jobs 301, 302, and 303, only job 305 is a finished good which is still on hand. So with that, we simply have to get this amount. So this should give us finished good, completed jobs on hand amounting to 12,510, which is equal to our ending finished goods as shown in our T account for finished goods. And that's the end for problem 2-2